Hey everyone, I'm Zarabeth, and I've been working in the restaurant industry for about 15 years now. And the thing I wish more people were informed on is how servers and people who earn tips to make a living get taxed on those tips. So let's start with a celebratory experience. Let's say it's your birthday and you're going out to a high-end restaurant, your friends made reservations for you, and it's a place you've always wanted to try. You get there and the server learns that it's your birthday and they go the extra mile to make it a special evening for you. Whether that means bringing extra portions of your favorite appetizer, making sure nobody's glass is empty, or even dessert was on the house. You didn't have to pay for your own birthday cake. How cool is that? Now, at the end of this time, when the bill comes, let's say some people in the group make comments like, well, this is a nice place. I'm sure they make good money. We don't need to leave a very big tip. Collectively, let's say the group leaves about $80. That sounds like a lot of money, and it is. But let's say it was a big group who was there for a few hours, and in total, the group ended up spending about $600 on drinks, food, whatever else. That $80 tip is only 13% of the total bill. So the part people who don't work in service don't see is that because it was only 13%, the server could potentially lose money and have to pay that back in taxes on their upcoming paycheck. So let's go back to where this started, because maybe you don't know this, but it's not common in the rest of the world to tip servers and bartenders. It's seen as a very American thing. And like most American things, it comes back around to rebuilding after the Civil War. So the concept of tipping, gratuity, cash in exchange for service, it became popular in the US in the 1860s. So the Emancipation Proclamation is newly passed, and people who were once enslaved are trying to find work. And they go into industries like cutting hair, waiting tables, shining shoes, serving people. And whether it was prejudice or just being in a post-war economy, there were many business owners who didn't want to pay wages to these people. And so what they said, we'll call it a compromise, they asked that the customers be the ones to leave cash or leave payment for the staff. And that's kind of where it got normalized. And it wasn't until 50 years later, we'll say the early, like 1913 is when the federal minimum wage was put into place. But it wouldn't be until the 1960s that the laws around minimum wage also applied to people earning tips. So that was 100 years of people specifically only making tips and not actually having a base pay, making their income a little unstable, but also keeping that level of work as being socially viewed as low class. And it still is a little bit today. And so today that translates a little bit into people thinking that other working class people are struggling in the same ways. And so when we tip from our own wallets, we always think, well, I only have so much, so leaving anything extra is generous. Especially here in the state of Washington. Now, in the United States, all 50 states have their own laws regarding how tips get taxed and what a minimum wage looks like. There is a federal base minimum wage, but every state addresses it differently. So specifically, let's talk about Washington, where we live, and our neighboring Idaho. Whether you're on that border of like Spokane, Coeur d'Alene, or Pullman, Moscow, you're going out kind of crosses that state line. So let's talk about both and see how they're different. Here in Washington, we have the highest minimum wage in the country, and we have for a very long time. So people think that having that base minimum wage means that anything on top of that is considered generous. And it is, and it's always appreciated no matter the amount. But the thing people don't know, even on top of our higher minimum wage, we get taxed more and in different ways. We are what is called a right to work state. And with that means that we are expected to make a certain amount of money in sales, and I need to edit this spot. We are expected to have a certain amount of tips based off of what our sales were. For example, let's say I did $100 in sales net and I was tipped $6. Okay, so 6%. The state tax, sales tax in Washington is about 8.7. We can round that up to 9. So I've only been tipped 6%. Tax is 9%. So on my own paycheck, that 3% difference is coming out of what I make in my hourly wage. So that sounds a little crazy, right? But because we make tips, we're expected to make a certain amount. Otherwise, our paychecks get penalized in different ways. Idaho does it a little bit differently. Idaho is what's called a minimum wage state. They're allowed to fluctuate their minimum wage. Now, there is a federal law for how low it can be, and the absolute bare minimum is $3.25. The state of Idaho, the minimum is $3.35. And between that and the federal minimum of $7.25, it's at the employer's discretion. Now, when a server in Idaho makes tips, they're expected to make enough to compensate for that gap between the $3.35 and the $7.25. And if they make more on top of that, great. But if they don't, it is up to their employer and the person who pays them to compensate for the difference. So by tipping less than matching tax, and I'm sorry, I don't remember what the state sales tax is in Idaho, but Idaho is also an income tax state, which is different from Washington. But that server in Idaho, now they're taking money from their employer, and their employer isn't going to keep people on staff who don't make enough on their own to keep that gap closed. I hope that makes sense. And so that is how these laws apply today, especially here in Washington and Idaho. And so as a general rule, I know we're always taught to tip based off of experience and quality of service. But like I said before, we're all falling on hard times. The economy doesn't look great. And people they tip off of their own wallet. We tend to tip from our own budget. And so the general rule of thumb is to look at the tax of your total bill and then double it. And what that does is by meeting the amount of the sales tax, the server has broken even. And then you double that, and the server then has enough money to actually take something home on top of that. Or, depending on the establishment, they tip out their bartender, they tip out their dishwasher, sometimes they even tip out their cooks. It changes from business to business, but that rule of double the tax helps everyone feel a little bit more secure. So this is going to sound a little sassy, but I'm going to leave you with this. The thing all servers wish that they could say to their customers: if you didn't budget for a tip, don't go out.